moment. If you see this channel, please share with your friends, because I need that subscribers and that watch time, because then you get monetization. Monetization means you get money, and I want to do something for charity, but I can't do that unless I get 1,000 subscribers. And is it 40,000 minute watch time? So if you don't have to subscribe, you just have to watch my videos all the way through. That's a lot you can give me. This is not money for me. I want to do stuff on it. I will do stuff on it. But I can't at the moment, because monetization means you get ads, so getting least money. And also, that also includes streaming. If you want to see me stream, that needs 1,000 subscribers. So yeah, just a quick disclaimer. You don't have to, but yeah. Videos like these before. The Beast did it. I'm pretty sure a load of other YouTubers did it. But I'm going to be saying Frosty 500 times. Not 1,000, 500. So, yeah, I've got my sister with me here to, like, count by a special way, which I'm not going to tell you, for all those copiers out there. I know you're there. Anyway, yeah, so, here it goes. So, are you ready? Just gonna have to go check. Okay. So, she's already got it on 3 at the moment, so I have to say it 3 times. After the 3 times, she can go. Okay? Frosty, 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 I'm forgetting how to do. Frosty, 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 frosty. Oh my god. Frosty, 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 frosty. Oh, we've hit the 500. Give it here. I'll show you. 5. That's backwards. Anyway, it says 500. That's backwards. So yeah, 500. 500. 500. So yeah, if you're looking for content, you came to the wrong place for this video. So yeah, if you're going to click that